Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Your Legislators. I'm Anthony Moreno. Joining us to talk about New Mexico's legislative session and issues facing the state is District 28 Democratic State Senator Siah Correa Hemphill. Thanks for joining us, Senator Correa Hemphill.
Thanks for having me. Happy to join you this morning.
It's great to welcome you to the program and to talk about the issues facing your district and the state. I want to start off with the budget. You sit on the Senate Finance Committee, so you're heavily involved with crafting the budget for the state of New Mexico. What are your thoughts going into this session? There's been a lot of talk about the influx of revenue that the state is going to have, but there's also some concerns about how to use that revenue. So I'd like to hear from you. What are your thoughts as lawmakers begin to craft the budget?
Thanks for the question. It is a big challenge. We know that we have about $3.6 billion surplus right now, and we know that we're not always going to have that money available, and we haven't historically had this level of revenue surplus. So we really want to be thoughtful about how we're investing this money and making meaningful change, generational change. Under the previous administration, there were a lot of budget cuts because the economy wasn't doing as well as it is now. And we had our behavioral health system really dismantled. And so rebuilding a lot of those systems that really contribute to strong quality of life in rural New Mexico especially, but certainly across New Mexico. And we really want to make sure that we are investing in infrastructure. A lot of this money is going to be non-recurring, so we want to be making those investments in our infrastructure that historically we haven't had the revenue to invest in. Education system, New Mexico has continued to rank low in the nation in terms of educational outcomes, and we know that having a highly educated workforce is only going to strengthen our economy, and also diversifying our economy is going to be critical moving forward. So we want to make sure that we're addressing the basic needs of our communities, and water is a big issue that we're discussing this year. We had a lot of flooding and fires and other crises across New Mexico, and in rural communities it's been really, really challenging to address the recovery needs. And so just being creative and coming up with different crisis funds, water funds to help to make sure that every single New Mexican has the water that they need. We're creating sustainable water safety across New Mexico. So in my district, for example, we had historic flooding that washed out a bridge or an inlet to a bridge. So Highway 180 was closed for a time. And a lot of those rural communities, ditch associations, acequias were wiped out. And we're still trying to get access to funds to help in the recovery efforts. And even though a lot of those communities did qualify for emergency funds, state funds, they don't often have the budget up front to be able to apply for the reimbursement funds. So what we learned during this crisis response was that the emergency declaration funds are reimbursable funds. So if you're a small entity, a government entity like a ditch association, you don't necessarily have a budget to be able to pay for the recovery up front and then apply for the reimbursement funds. So I've gotten together with a lot of the other senators to find creative ways to address those challenges and come up with some good solutions, some rural infrastructure crisis funds so that communities can draw from those funds and respond in a crisis situation.
This is an issue that many communities across the state are dealing with and have dealt with due to the wildfires that impacted the state in recent years, especially last year. What are some of the conversations like in Santa Fe right now in addressing what the state can do to help ensure that communities don't have to deal with this down the road, or are more prepared?
Right, yes, being more prepared. And I've had a lot of conversations with Ali Rai from Homeland Security, talking about how to create some funds so that if a community qualified for FEMA, for example, they can apply for either a loan or a grant from a fund, from like a rural infrastructure crisis fund or just a crisis fund. So they can apply for these funds and get federal matching dollars, or get a loan so that there's some funds available to respond to these crises, and then apply for the reimbursement funds that would go back into the funds. So Senator Worth has a water conservation bill that he would like, I think it's like $250 million to create a water conservation fund to go toward water conservation efforts. That I had a conversation with him just to make sure that rural communities are prioritized. A lot of times in our rural communities, we don't have the capacity to complete complicated application processes, for example, or the capacity to then manage those water projects as they get funded. And so I want to make sure that in rural communities that we have a real streamlined process to apply for those funds, and then there's some assistance provided by the state so that we have the project coordinator, the project manager, to help those communities be able to really make sure that we're investing the money available in water projects that are going to last and have long-term, be helpful long-term, so that they're not just getting wiped out again. So there are some new, there's some new technology to create water infrastructure along the rivers that help work with our unique rivers. So in New Mexico, we're really unique in that we don't always have the water, and when it rains, sometimes we have way more water than we anticipated. So our rivers tend to expand really quickly, and so we want to make sure that we're investing in water infrastructure that's going to work with our unique rivers here instead of getting wiped out every time we have a substantial rainfall.
Now, I don't think our audience it's no surprise to them that when we're talking about water, we're also talking about potential disagreements that happen within communities, not only in our state, but also with other states. Is this something that lawmakers in Santa Fe are looking at to help, when you talk about streamline that process, to ensure that we come to some agreements with water? I know you are working, according to your legislative website page, on water planning legislation. Could you share with us a little bit about this?
Sure, you're absolutely right. We have limited water, and often there's disagreements about how we're going to utilize the limited water that we do have available. So in my southwestern neck of the woods, we have the Gila River, and back in like 2004, there was the Arizona Water Settlement Act. And that allowed us to be able to keep 1,400 acre feet of water in exchange for paying for the rightful owners of the water, which is the Gila Indian tribe in Arizona. So we were given like at the time, $60 million for those rural communities to address the water needs in Hidalgo County, Grant County, Catron County, and Luna County. And so the money went in a fund, but there was a lot of disagreement about how to use that money and what to do with the 1,400 acre feet. So there were many, many years of just fighting and legal disputes. And so back in 2021, we were able to pass House Bill 200, which was considered the Gila River bill. And that removed the possibility for the water to be diverted. So a lot of the environmentalists didn't want to see the 1,400 acre feet stored in a diversion, and they wanted the money in that was provided to the unit fund, the $60 million. It's now about $85.6 million in the unit fund. They wanted to use that money to go toward addressing the water needs in those 4 counties. And so with the passage of House Bill 200, we now have removed the initial consultative role from the CAP entity and given that to the Water Trust Board. The complication was that the Water Trust Board has a pretty complicated application process requiring a lot of technical data. And so I'm providing our local COG, the Southwest Council of Governments, $600,000 to be dispersed over 4 years so that they can hire a person to provide the technical assistance and the project management and project coordination as we get the funding out to these small government entities like ditch associations and acequias, municipalities that are requesting the money. And then I've had a lot of conversations with the state engineer so that we can create a new application, a more streamlined application process for the Water Trust Board so that these rural communities can quickly and efficiently access the money in the unit fund. And the federal government owes us about another $20 million. So overall, we're going to have a little over $100 million of funding capacity for small water projects. We just need to be able to create the application process that is going to fit the needs of our rural communities. So that's just an example of how we can have the funds, but because of some disagreements about how that money is going to be utilized, it can get bogged down. And so we're hoping that this is a good solution and this money can go for to create generational water sustainability in the southwestern part of the state.
Now, you've already mentioned that you're very concerned about rural communities being left out of the conversations. You have legislation that addresses crisis response in rural communities. Can you tell us about this bill?
Yes. So I was part of the Rural Economic Opportunity Task Force. I co-chaired that with Representative Candy Sweetser. She's from Luna County. And one of the biggest themes that we heard over the last 2 interim was that we have to have the infrastructure in rural communities before we can really create economic progress in rural communities. We have to have water, is really the basic thing that we need access to. And without water, we're never going to be able to create a lot of economic prosperity for rural communities. So that rural crisis fund is really, the intention is to be able to, if there's federal dollars that a rural community qualifies for, but they don't have the federal matching dollars, this is a fund that they could draw from to qualify for federal dollars. And in addition, if there's a crisis, this is money that could be available year round. So a lot of people don't realize that we're a volunteer part-time legislature. We're the appropriating body. So when we're not in session, we're limited in what we could do in response to a crisis. I can show up, I can call a secretary of an agency, but I can't necessarily get money out to these communities. So this would be a fund that we can access throughout the year and be able to respond quickly and efficiently in a crisis situation.
Now, you mentioned being a volunteer legislature. That's been in the news quite a bit recently as lawmakers have been discussing the creation of a committee to examine if New Mexico should move to a paid legislature. What are your thoughts on that issue?
That's a great question and probably a controversial question, but I think the best part of this is that it opens up the conversation. A lot of people have no idea the limited amount of staff and resources that the legislature really has. It's been a really great learning experience for me as well. I had no idea myself before I was serving in this. I assumed legislators got paid. So it's great to be able to highlight that these are public servants who have given up careers often, time with their family and their own resources to be able to come up and serve in the legislature. And I think, bottom line, the most important thing that I would appreciate is having staff year round, because that is really challenging. And you wouldn't believe how many times I get a phone call or a text message or email from a constituent asking can you please help me get a hold of the senator so that I could set up a meeting time with her? And I'm like, yeah, it's just me. Like, I don't have staff scheduling things for me or helping organize a town hall. And so that would be really, really helpful, just to have staff throughout the interim, to be able to provide constituent resources. There was a time, I think it was the end of September, we had an asphalt emulsion spill on Highway 15 in my district. And I was in Los Luceros with Representative Candy Sweetser. We were chairing the Rural Economic Opportunity Task Force Committee, talking about water. And I got a call from Grant County saying there was an asphalt emulsion spill, and the environmental department had not been notified, and getting called out on social media. Where's the senator? She's chairing a committee. She's not here responding to this crisis. And that's just an example of like the differences in representing a rural community compared to maybe an urban area where you have people who could respond to an environmental crisis like that. And so they were really dependent upon me to have those conversations with the environmental department and make sure that we had some people coming and responding. And so in a few days I was up there myself, helping with the cleanup efforts. And on my way home, actually, there was an older woman who had flagged me down. I was going over the Black Range in the mountain pass, and an older woman jumped out in front of me, flagged me down, and said her grandson had fallen down the mountain. She's disabled. Can I help retrieve her grandson? So I'm imagining that there's like a child that fell down the mountain, but it was actually a full-grown man. And I could not lift him up. I had to flag down another car, and it took 3 adults to go down and pull him up. He had lost his balance, and those are just some like crazy stories that you deal with in rural New Mexico compared to being in an urban area. But also, I've recognized the inequities in how capital outlay or junior money is distributed across the state. So in an urban area, you've got several legislators representing Albuquerque, for example. So all of those resources, all of that capital outlay is being concentrated up there. And many of my colleagues are able to give their capital outlay or their junior funds to like a museum or a park, all of these things that really go a long way in creating quality of life for families in New Mexico. But I represent 3 vast, huge counties, and the needs in those counties are just expansive. So I get usually it's been $3.1 million of capital outlay, and that's just a drop in the bucket. I'm giving it to for a trash compactor or to address wastewater. And I certainly don't have any left over to give to a park or a museum, but I would love to. And so I really hope that we are able to look at that and create a little more equity. And whenever we're able to prioritize those rural communities to access funds and streamline that process and improve the capacity in our rural communities, that's going to go a long way in addressing the unmet needs of our rural communities.
Now, you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation about how the behavioral health system was impacted in our state. Your district, there was a lot of concern about behavioral health services and substance abuse services. Do you see those being addressed in this year's budget? I know you're going to have a say on crafting that, so what are your thoughts on that issue?
Yes, that has been a big topic of conversation in all the committees, certainly in the Legislative Finance Committee meetings throughout the interim. We've had a lot of discussions about how to address substance use disorders as well as other behavior mental health challenges. And in my area, we had border area mental health, and under the previous administration, that was shut down. And so we're trying to rebuild that mental health infrastructure in rural communities. And it's an issue that's near and dear to my heart. I'm a school psychologist. I just finished my 29th year in education last year. But also it's personal. So I have a son who was born with a rare genetic syndrome, and he's 27 now, but when he was 4 years old, he was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, which is bone cancer. He had to have 18 courses of chemotherapy. He had a left leg amputation when he was only 4. And having that trauma, that medical trauma, watching my son at such a young age go through just horrific surgeries and medical treatments throughout his life, was really made me passionate about how to learn how to respond to trauma in the most helpful way. To how can I help him? How can I respond to the challenges he's experiencing so that he can recover emotionally from this very traumatic situation that we have no control over? And not only for him, but the trauma that the whole family experienced. And I know that there are families all across New Mexico in similar situations. And so as a school psychologist, I started to prioritize training in trauma-informed responses and doing trainings with other educators, because I really believe that the more adults across New Mexico that we're able to provide trauma-informed practices to, the better we're all going to be able to respond to people who have been exposed to trauma or just been in a family where maybe there was a lot of dysfunction. And so some of the bills that I'm working on with Senator Hickey, he's a retired physician, and we're working on a parity bill for mental health providers so that they're given the same reimbursement rates as a medical provider. And also we're reducing a lot of the red tape that is currently required to get a referral for a substance use therapist or other behavioral mental health therapists. So we want to streamline that process. And there's also going to be a rural healthcare fund. I think it's $200 million that the governor's requesting for this rural fund that would go to encourage physicians and other providers to go to rural communities, to serve our rural communities and address some of those challenges that we have in rural communities, just being able to retain and recruit doctors, therapists. And there's also some talk of facility in Las Cruces that would be specific, I think it's 45 beds, and it would be for substance use treatment and other behavioral health challenges. In Grant County and Silver City, we have two CASA, so they're requesting some capital outlay. I think it's $500,000 that they're requesting so that we can start to really utilize that center. I toured it last month, and it's a beautiful facility. They just don't have the funds to keep it operating. It was open right before COVID, and weren't able to keep the doors open because of the cost. So we want to find more cost-effective ways to recruit and retain providers in rural communities so that we can have those substance use treatment centers across rural New Mexico.
There's been so much talk about the increase in revenue being available for the next fiscal year for New Mexico, but there's also been some concerns raised due to New Mexico's dependence on the oil and gas industry for that revenue. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how do you balance planning and making decisions for this money that's available in the next fiscal year, but still trying to keep in mind that the oil and gas industry could be impacted. We've seen it happen several years ago when the state was dramatically impacted by that. So what are your thoughts on crafting the next year's budget but still keeping that in mind, what are some things that you're concerned about?
Some of the very creative solutions that I've heard that I think would be wonderful to invest in are creating different fund accounts. So we would have like a mental health fund. So and I'll just give you a little bit of history for the early childhood trust fund. There was, I think, $300 million originally put in that fund, and it just exploded. And now we have, I think it's $3 billion, maybe a little over that in a very short period of time. And so using this money that we currently have available for investing and creating future money is our challenge right now. And creating some sub accounts where we would have like a water conservation fund and an education fund and mental health and healthcare, so that we're creating these funds. So when oil and gas inevitably, in its volatile situation, if we don't have the funds because oil and gas is down, we still have these sub accounts that we can draw from. So we're not having to make these really painful cuts in these systems that historically New Mexicans really, really rely on. And that has a huge benefit, because what we can do to improve the mental health of people is creating as much predictability and routine. And when you're reliant on a volatile market, especially over a third of our budget is dependent upon oil and gas, that creates so much uncertainty, so much unpredictability, and that negatively impacts learning and memory, because you're in stress response. You don't know, are you going to have your basic needs met? Are we going to have to move back into a special session and make those painful cuts across agencies? And I see that fear in legislators who were serving during that time when they had to come in and make painful cuts to agency budgets. And people were begging, like, please don't touch education. Don't. All of those systems are incredibly important to address the basic needs of New Mexicans. So we want to make sure that we have the funds to continue to invest in those systems that the large percentage of people living in poverty across New Mexico rely so heavily on.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I do want to thank you, District 28 Democratic State Senator Siah Correa Hemphill. Thank you for joining us on Your Legislators.
Thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. It was great spending the morning with you.
That's it for this episode. Remember, you can always keep updated with the latest news at our website, krwg.org, and email us at feedback@nmsu.edu. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.